What if I told you that some dumb, or maybe not so dumb, 13-year-old kid in 1949 could have inadvertently inspired one of the scariest movies ever made? Not just inspired it, but helped create what is now its own genre of horror movies. I'm talking about the first horror movie ever nominated for Best Picture. That's right. I'm talking about the levitating off the bed, head spinning, pea soup projectile puking masterpiece, The Exorcist. That movie, the one that had people passing out in theaters and walking out because it was too disturbing, it was based on a real case, a real kid, and a real exorcism. And that kid, he grew up, got a job at NASA, and helped build the heat shields for the Apollo missions. And the story, it was so disturbing that the church went out of their way to keep his name anonymous. So what actually happened? Was he possessed by a demon? Or in some accounts, the devil himself? Did he fake it and manage to fool his family and members of the church? Or is the truth buried somewhere in between? I dug into the actual documented evidence, the priest's diary, church records, and eyewitness accounts. And let me tell you, it's a wild ride. Let's get into it. Welcome. I'm your host, Nick, and this is Behind the Horror. And today, we are looking at the horror behind The Exorcist. You guys have seen The Exorcist, right? You know the one, Linda Blair, where she has a little quality time with a crucifix. You probably know the movie is based on a book, and the book was loosely, and I mean really loosely, based on true events. A real exorcism sanctioned by the Catholic Church. The movie takes place in Georgetown, and that's where the true events started. But here's what most people don't know. A significant part of what really happened, the actual documented exorcism, took place in St. Louis, Missouri. I grew up in St. Louis, and I had no idea until the late 80s, early 90s when I was in high school that any of this story may have taken place where I grew up. I started dating this girl who was a freshman at St. Louis University, or SLU. And one night she laid it all out. The urban legend she'd heard from a friend. You've seen The Exorcist, right? Challenging my young male machismo. Of course I had. You know it's based on a true story, right? I'm pretty sure I lied and said I did. Well, you know the actual exorcism took place on SLU's campus, right? Naturally, now I'm roped all the way in. She went to SLU. Of course I had to hear the story. It happened in one of the dorms on campus. The room was on the second floor. And of course, it happened before anyone telling the story was alive, or on SLU's campus for that matter. But after everything went down, the university closed the entire building and boarded up the doors. Guess it was cheaper than knocking it down. But the college kids kept breaking in to see the room. So the university actually removed a portion of the hallway floor to keep the kids from getting in. And even with the floors gone, even with the building closed and the power turned off, sometimes you could still see a light coming from the room. It flickered like a candle, just like the candle that was on the bedside table when the exorcism was performed. And when the moon was full and you watched really closely, you could faintly make out the figure of a young boy walking past the window. Now look, I was 17 and that was some creepy shit. That story had just enough legs to make you think twice. But that story, that girl, that's the reason we're here right now. And that's why this is episode 1. So let's talk about the kid, not the one with the propensity to profusely puke pea soup, the real kid, Ronald Hunkler. Normal kid, 13 years old, normal neighborhood in Cottage City, Maryland. And when I say normal, I mean painfully normal. Middle-class family, quiet neighborhood. I'd say quaint, if that didn't make me want to spew split pea myself. Ronald was nothing but boring. But Ronald had an aunt, and his aunt was anything but boring. She was fascinated by the occult. The idea that the dead don't just disappear, that if you know how to listen, you can still reach them. And the story goes, she introduced Ronald to the Ouija board and taught him how to use it. Hold on to that. So you're 13 years old, living a completely mundane life. And here's your aunt teaching you how to communicate with the dead, about the afterlife, about the supernatural. That sounds like the coolest aunt ever, or a really good reason to call Child Protective Services. You decide. Shortly after, his aunt gets sick and eventually dies. And that's when stuff starts to get weird. Things start out slowly in Ronald's house. Dripping sounds, but none of the faucets are running. Scratching under the floorboards. Ronald's dad is convinced it's mice, but no evidence of vermin was ever found. Then the furniture starts moving on its own. Footsteps when nobody's there. Ronald's mother is at her wit's end, and she's just becoming more and more convinced that something supernatural is going on. So she turns to the only person she can think of, the minister of their local church. That reverend's name was Luther Miles Schultz, born and raised in the Lutheran Church. Skeptical, but not wanting to rule anything out, he arranged for Ronald to spend the night at his own home. Like a scientist running a controlled experiment, he wants to observe Ronald in his space, away from the family, away from whatever's happening in the house. What Schultz witnesses that night, he puts into writing. The bed shakes violently beneath Ronald while he sleeps. An armchair tilts up on its own and flips over. A pallet of blankets slides across the room with nobody touching it. Scratching sounds in the walls. He documents everything. A first-hand written account from a witness who has no real reason to believe the boy was possessed. He's Lutheran. He has no stake in confirming a Catholic possession. Whatever he saw with fresh eyes. But, like I said, Schultz is a Lutheran minister. He doesn't perform exorcisms. He can document what he sees, but he can't really do anything about it. So the family turns to the Catholic Church. Enter Father Edward Hughes, a Catholic priest from Mount Rainier, Maryland, right next door to Cottage City. He's the local Catholic priest, the first person with any kind of official Catholic Church authority to look at Ronald directly. Hughes attempts a blessing, then something more formal. Accounts say this happened at Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C., a controlled environment where they could manage whatever was about to happen. It did not go well. During an attempted exorcism, Ronald allegedly gets his hand free from his restraints, rips a bed spring from the mattress, and uses it as a weapon. He slashes Hughes' arm from shoulder to wrist. The wound reportedly required over 100 stitches. Attempted exorcism failed. Hughes is done. And then shortly after that failed attempt, something new appears on Ronald's skin. Deep red welts and scratches in his skin near his ribcage that spelled out a word. Louis. L-O-U-I-S. The family stares at it. Ronald's mother has relatives that live in St. Louis. She grew up there. She takes it as a sign. Overnight, they pack up and move from Maryland to Missouri. The family settles in with relatives in Belle Noire, just outside the city. But word travels quickly about the possessed boy in the St. Louis suburbs. And that's where the Catholic Church, the real Catholic Church, enters the picture. After a review of Ronald's case, the Archbishop of St. Louis, Archbishop Joseph Ritter, formally authorizes an exorcism. And I want you to understand what this means. In 1949, an authorized exorcism was not just a routine occurrence. The Vatican doesn't just hand these out. This isn't a couple of rogue priests going off script. This went all the way up the chain of command. Archbishop Ritter signs off on March 16th, 1949. Father William Bodern is assigned as the lead. Father Raymond Bishop assists and starts keeping a diary. 26 pages, 29 by some accounts. Every session, every incident documented in real time by a man who was in that room. Father Walter Halloran, a Jesuit scholastic. Think of him as a priest in training, a man of serious academic and religious credentials, is also brought in to be part of the team. Remember that name. We'll be coming back to Halloran. The first sessions happen at the relative's house, and when things start to escalate beyond what can be managed in a residential setting, Ronald is admitted to the Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis. Private room, controlled environment. Whatever's happening to this kid, the church wants to contain it. What happens over the next 6 weeks in that hospital room is, let's just say, difficult to explain. More words carved into Ronald's skin. Evil, hell, Christ, deep and bloody. And reportedly others, spite, a Roman numeral, even the word Satan, though those show up more in later accounts than they did in the original story. The priests are hit, scratched, and bitten. Father Halloran has his nose broken. Ronald speaks in voices that aren't his own. He speaks Latin, having never studied the language. 30 sessions, 6 weeks. And then, Monday, April 18th, 1949, 11 o'clock at night, Ronald bolts upright. And according to the documented record, he speaks. Not in his own voice, in a voice none of the priests have ever heard before. And he says, Satan, Satan, I am Saint Michael. I command you, Satan, and the other evil spirits to leave this body. In the name of Dominus, immediately, now, now, now. A final violent spasm. And then Ronald Hunkler, 13-year-old kid from Cottage City, Maryland, opens his eyes, looks at the men around him, and says 3 words. He is gone. Ronald later said he had a vision. Saint Michael, the archangel, slaying a dragon. Case closed. The church closes the file. The priests go back to their lives, and Ronald Hunkler goes home. So that's the story. 13-year-old kid, Ouija board, possessed by the devil, 6 weeks of documented chaos in a St. Louis hospital room, and then it's over. And for about 20 years, almost nobody outside of a small circle of Jesuit priests and one Lutheran minister knew any of this happened. And then, in 1971, William Peter Blatty, who'd been sitting on this story since he read about it in the paper when he was a student at Georgetown, publishes his novel. 2 years later, William Friedkin turns it into a movie. And suddenly, everyone wants to know what really happened. So pay attention to this next part, because almost every account you've ever heard about this case, every interview, every investigation, every documentary came out after the movie made this story worth talking about. Father Halloran didn't start giving interviews until the 1980s. The most comprehensive outside investigation didn't happen until 1998. Ronald's actual identity wasn't publicly confirmed until 2021, a year after he died. Think about what that means. Every single person who ever spoke publicly about this case knew exactly how famous it was before they opened their mouths. So let's start with the Ouija board. You remember the occult obsessed aunt? The Ouija board was such a prominent detail in the actual case that they ham-fistedly worked it into the movie. Here's what the aunt's own daughter had to say about it. Her mother was, quote, not even interested in the occult or Ouija boards. She didn't give one to Ronald. She never even touched one. One of the most famous details of the entire case was likely invented after the book and the movie, a fact that got retrofitted back into the original story. People saw the film, assumed it was accurate, and that version became the truth. That's no minor detail to get wrong. That's the catalyst for the whole story. Remember Reverend Schultz, the independent witness, the minister with no skin in the game? Here's what I left out. Schultz was personally interested in parapsychology. After this case, he didn't just write it up and file it away. He presented it to a Washington, D.C. branch of the Society for Parapsychology. He wasn't a skeptic. He was already a believer. And probably, like me when I was 17, wanted it to be true. Was it Schultz who first suggested Ronald might be possessed and not the other way around? What if Ronald's mother went to her minister for comfort and Schultz saw something he'd been waiting his whole career to see? And here's the kicker. Joseph Banks Rhine, a parapsychologist himself, someone professionally predisposed to believe in exactly this kind of thing, said he wondered if Schultz had unconsciously exaggerated some of the facts. The most credible independent witness in this entire case very possibly had his own agenda from the beginning. Now, the words on Ronald's skin. Skeptical investigator Joel Nickel documented something I kept coming back to. Quote, although the scratched messages proliferated, they never again appeared on a difficult to reach portion of the boy's anatomy. You probably caught that never again part of the quote. One bishop recorded scratches on the boy's back. Nichols' argument was that a 13-year-old boy, given some time and a mirror, could have scratched his own back. Every single marking, every word, everyone in a location, a 13-year-old could have reached with his own hands. Not one mark ever appears somewhere he couldn't have scratched himself. And here's the thing that got me. Father Halloran, the guy who documented everything, the man in the room, the scholar, the man who should have questioned everything, never once checked Ronald's fingernails when the marks appeared. Not once. Isn't that the most obvious first thing to do? That bed spring, the one Ronald allegedly ripped from the hospital bed in Maryland and used to slash Father Hughes from shoulder to wrist, over 100 stitches. Researcher Mark Opsasnick spent years on this case. He found no evidence that Father Hughes ever performed an exorcism on Ronald. None. The only documented contact between Hughes and Ronald was a single consultation at a church. No hospital, no exorcism, no bed spring. The most dramatic scene in the Maryland portion of this story, the one that sent the family running to St. Louis, may have been attributed to a priest who had almost no contact with Ronald at all. And then there's Father Halloran, the last surviving witness, the one person who was there for all 30 sessions, all 6 weeks, and lived long enough to answer questions about it. I told you what the documented record says about the ending. The voice, St. Michael, he is gone. That version comes from Halloran's accounts and the book Possessed by Thomas B. Allen. I'll leave a link in the description down below if you want to check out Allen's book. It's an interesting read. Now back to the voice, St. Michael, he is gone. All of that comes from Halloran's account, except when documentary filmmakers sat down with Halloran, and they sat down with him more than once, the ending came out differently. Ronald rises in the bed, speaks in a strange voice, contorts, collapses. Still dramatic, but not the same story. And then there's the third version, the one where Halloran said the boy never changed his voice at all. He just repeated Latin words he'd heard the priest say over and over and over again throughout the exorcism. The Latin that Ronald supposedly spoke miraculously, he'd heard those exact words for 6 weeks straight. 3 versions of the same ending from the same man, the only man still alive who was there. And Halloran himself told author Thomas B. Allen that documentary filmmakers had coached him on what to say, said they broke him down after several on-camera interviews. Our scholastic witness, by his own admission, adjusted his story depending on who was asking and how many times they asked. Halloran walked it back even further. At one point he said, and this is a quote, "I saw more evil in Vietnam than I ever saw in that hospital bed." Now, Father Bodern, the lead exorcist, went to his grave in 1983 absolutely certain the possession was real. Never wrote a book, never gave interviews, didn't make a dime. Just a priest who believed until the end. But we never got his story. So there are so many holes in this story that it's pretty easy to build the case that a lot of the people involved embellished the facts, either to further their own beliefs or to get a little piece of that exorcist money. But then there's the diary, Father Bishop's diary, written in real time in 1949, before the book, before the film, before any of this was worth embellishing. That diary was sealed in a security room on the 5th floor of the Alexian Brothers Hospital for 25 years before a construction worker found it during demolition in 1978. Nobody was padding a book deal when they wrote it. Nobody knew it would ever be found. The diary is currently held in the Jesuit archives and has never been fully published. What I have been referencing is what was sourced from Thomas B. Allen's book, Possessed. Even our primary source is a secondhand account. So here's my take. You can build a pretty solid case that Ronald was a 13-year-old kid who figured out he could get an extraordinary amount of attention by doing something, well, extraordinary. He meets Schultz, who fuels his fire, maybe even leads him into the possession angle. And once it gets too big, once a priest is in the hospital and a friggin' archbishop is involved, he's in way too deep to back out without admitting what he'd done. Even the diary, the most credible document in this entire case, records that on at least one occasion, Ronald was directly observed scratching words into his own skin with his fingernails. The priest wrote that down. Either Ronald Hunkler was a 13-year-old kid who managed to con the Catholic Church, a Lutheran minister, and everyone who loved him, and the diary is just the most detailed record of how good he was at it, or that diary is exactly what it looks like. A first-hand account of something that cannot be explained, written in real time by a man with no audience and no reason to lie. The one person who knew the actual truth, the kid himself, Ronald, confided in a close companion before he died, "I was just a bad boy." And then he took whatever happened in 1949 straight to the grave. I'll let you sit with that. If you guys want to dive deeper into this one, I've linked both books that got me here in the description. William Peter Blatty's novel and Thomas B. Allen's Possessed. Allen's is the closest thing to the actual diary that any of us will ever see, but both are worth the read. If you like this, hit subscribe. And if this is your first time here, of course it is, welcome. This is what we do. Every creepy little thing you've ever loved started somewhere. A lot of them started somewhere real. So you tell me, drop a comment with a horror movie you want me to dig into next. If the rabbit hole is deep enough, we're going down it. I'm Nick, and this has been Behind the Horror.